Shabbat Shalom. So if Rosh Chodesh is coming up, that means we will be in the time of the new moon, which means there will be no moon in the sky for one of the evenings next week, and then a sliver before and after it. And that is the perfect time for stargazing. Who here remembers the first time they looked through a telescope and saw another planet? We got to get an astronomy class trip going here. This is terrible. It is amazing. You go out, and usually you're in the middle of nowhere to escape from the city lights, or you're going to a massive telescope that doesn't care about city lights so much for close observations. And somebody who knows far more about astronomy than anyone else in the field will have set up a telescope, and it's just pointing up into the sky. And they say, here, take a look. And you bend down, and you put your eye against the little hole, and you're trying to line up your eyes and the little light coming through. And there's Jupiter, just floating in the sky. And if you have a very good telescope or a very good instructor, you can actually see little dots next to Jupiter. The moons orbiting it. Or perhaps it's focused on Saturn. Or you can see the red glow of Mars, or the swirling clouds of Venus. It is absolutely astonishing, and it fills up with a sense of awe and wonder if you're Jewish. Because it actually scared the bejesus out of people within Western Europe and Eastern Europe when telescopes were first invented. You have to understand they have a very different relationship to the heavens within that particular religious culture. They saw the heavens as being the perfect reflection of God. And by perfect, they meant perfect. The world, the earth, was grubby and dirty and filthy and full of death and blood and just poverty and all that other smelly stuff. But the heavens were transcendent. And they literally believed that the space above earth, that was the actual heavens of God. And when you looked up at it and you saw its beautiful splendor and its clean, pristine structure, and the fact that it all went around us, that you could tell what God's perfection was meant to be, and you were reminded how miserable you were on earth. And therefore you should be happy that eventually you would die and God would take you away from this horrible hellhole, and then you'd get to go to the good place. But what happened when they turned the telescope on the sky? Turns out it's got bumps. Turns out it's got dirt up there too. Turns out there were little tiny dots going around other planets, which means we may not be the center of everything. And it turns out when you really start observing all of the movements of the other planets, and you do the math really, really good, they don't go around us at all. As a matter of fact, they seem to be going around the sun. Which doesn't make any sense because it looks like it's going around us. All of a sudden, the world, the universe, is upside down. All of a sudden, we are nothing. We are just some other insignificant rock floating through space, orbiting a giant fusion reactor with other rocks that are nearby. What's the point? Tear up the Bible, let's go home. Atheism, here I come. And I think this was an absolutely, literally, earth and heaven-shattering revelation for many people in Europe. And the Jews went, oh, okay, that's fine. I mean, yeah, we did sort of believe up till that point what science had taught us, from Aristotle science, that the earth was at the center, and we sort of thought everything went around us. But we didn't see that as being a theological claim, partly because we never disparaged the earth. We never thought this place was a terrible place to be. We didn't see the world as being the world of sin. We saw it as being the world of potential. That, unfortunately, had a lot of people sitting in it, but that wasn't the world's fault. And when we looked up at the sky, some people thought of it as being heaven itself, but most thought of it as being simply a reflection of God's harmony. Shalom b'momah, peace on high. Whenever we say, Oseh Shalom b'momah, whenever we sing that line or chant it as part of the Kaddish, we are reminding ourselves that we looked at the sky and we saw everything moving in perfect, harmonious balance. Anybody who has spent more than a little bit of a time in a field looking through a telescope can't help but come away with a deep appreciation that it all works. Why aren't they all flying into each other? Why aren't stars collapsing and planets exploding and everything just flying off in chaos? Why is there order? Order so good that you can actually schedule your calendar around it and be able to know when to plant your crops, when to harvest them, when the rains will come, when the rains won't come. It's a miracle. It is shalom. It is harmony in the sky. But after we say, Oseh Shalom B'Molad, God is the one who has made harmony in the sky, we say, Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu. How about a little bit of that for us? How about a little bit of that harmony for us down here? Except even as we say it, there is an underlying principle in Judaism. That shalom on high, the peace that is found within the harmony of creation, that's found throughout the universe, that's the easy kind of peace. Because planets and stars, they don't get to pick where they go. Right? A planet doesn't wake up one day and say, you know what? That other planet has a better orbit. I'm going to go move over to his orbit and just push him out. You don't have to worry about planets doing that. You don't have to worry about the sun saying, I don't see why I should have to share my light with those people. I'm going to keep my light for myself. No, the sun will burn as the sun will burn, and its light will go where God's laws of nature tell it to go. And so, of course, there's harmony up there. Of course, there is shalom, there is peace. But down here on earth, well, you do get people who wake up in the morning and say, I don't know, let's invade the Sudetenland. That piece of Poland, that looks pretty good to me. These parts of Africa, well, the people there aren't using it well. How about we establish a colony? People can make decisions, and nations can as well. Which means when we say, who's going to say shalom, that God will make peace for us and for all of Israel, we must mean something more than God imposing peace upon us. Because God has made it very clear that that is not going to happen. That God will not force us to choose peace. Instead, God turns it around to us. And in the psalm that we read this morning in Pesukei de Zimra, Pesukei de Zimra, we say, Bakesh Shalom, V'rofehu. You must demand, you must seek peace, and you must pursue it. Peace will not fall in your lap. Peace is something that must be seized. You have to hunt for peace, for the opportunities for peace. The great commentator Ibn Ezra says, why would God tell us to Bakesh Shalom? Why would God tell us to seek peace? I mean, after all, peace, with or without, can't I just live a life? Why? Because if you do not seek peace, especially, he argues, between nations, guess what happens? Those who have power will establish themselves as dominant over those who have less power. And you don't want that. This is not the way you want the world to work, with power being the ultimate arbiter of who gets what. Anybody who's ever been on an elementary school playground will know you don't want to just have all of the balls going to the guy with the biggest fists. And so you have to seek peace. You have to seek to establish a system, to have justice that will not allow might to be the ultimate decider in any conflict. Rashi goes one step further and says, not only do you need to seek peace, but you Bakesh Shalom, you seek peace within your own domain, and V'rofehu, and you will pursue it in other places as well. Introducing us to a very important concept, which is, it takes two to make peace. At least two, depending upon the nature of the arrangement. I know there's the old joke about it takes two to make a war, which is actually not true. It really only takes one jerk with a gun to make war. But it absolutely takes two to make peace. Because as much as you may want peace, if the other person doesn't, you're not getting it. Instead, there has to be a concerted effort on your part to find a way to make them want peace. The Torah tells us that when we are coming up to an enemy city, even as we are about to besiege it, that we are required to send an offer of peace. Now you might think, once the army's been mobilized, once the troops are there at the walls, shouldn't we just basically say the opportunity for peace is gone? You know, let's finish the job. But no, says the Torah, and no, says Jewish law, is codified for the last 2,000 years. You send an emissary of peace. And if they say no, then yes, you do what is necessary and you fight the battle as it must be fought. But if they say yes, you cancel the war. The soldiers go home, you sit down, you work out the negotiations between the different parties, you reconcile whatever the outstanding issues are, and you're good. And even if the war begins, even if they say no initially, you still have to leave one part of the city where those who are inside can flee. You have to leave an escape route. You cannot completely surround the city in order that you will annihilate all within it. For there are people who are in that city who do not want the war. And by keeping them in the city completely, all you do, the Torah implies, is force them to fight against you. Give them an escape clause, give them an escape hatch, give them a road out of town, and a lot of people will choose to leave rather than fight in a war that they do not believe in. And so if you allow them to leave, you will create the seeds for potential peace down the road with them, even if those who wish to remain and fight, rather than establishing peace, are not going to be as easily persuaded. We have been pursuing peace since the Torah was first given. If you have paid attention at all throughout the book of Bamidbar, or throughout the book of Devarim, where we hear the recount of the story of Bamidbar, you will know that every time we came to the border of a new country on our trip out of Egypt and towards the land of Israel, we say, hey guys, we're passing through peacefully, right? Just let us travel. And every time there was a fight. Did you ever stop to wonder, why did we keep saying we're coming? Why not just surprise attack them? They're going to attack us anyway. They all attack us anyway eventually. Why not get the jump on them first? Because the Torah doesn't work like that. Even if it would be more efficient, even if it would be a superior military strategy, we do not attack without offering the option of peace. This is what the Torah has given us. This is what our ancestors fought for and survived to continue to promote in our world. In 1948, a tiny little strip of land was given the go-ahead by the United Nations to become its own independent country, Medinat Israel. There was another group of people also given a go-ahead. They didn't take the go-ahead. Instead, they and many of the neighbors decided to attack Israel. The Arab alliance that assaulted Israel in 48. A lot of people said, look, we tried to have peace, the war has begun, we must fight the war, and Israel fought the war. And by strength of arms and miracle of God's support, Israel survived that onslaught and was able to establish herself, and thank God is still there to this day, having had to fight many other wars in the meantime. But did Israel ever give up on trying to find peace with her neighbors? Never. Never. Because you have to seek peace, you have to pursue peace. But the peace that God makes in the harmony of the universe above is not going to be a gimme for us on earth. And that doesn't mean that we dismantle the army. It doesn't mean that you ground all your fighter jets. It just means you keep the army and the fighter jets idling in the background while you continue the negotiations as long as possible. And eventually, those negotiations have borne fruit. Israel eventually established a peace treaty with Egypt in 1979. It established a peace treaty with Jordan 20 years later in 1994, if I'm not mistaken. And just this last week, after more than 20 years of quiet and no seeming progress on establishing peace with any of the other nations of the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, has come through brokered talks facilitated by the United States to say they will normalize relationships with Israel. This seems wonderful. It's not making everybody happy. people who are criticizing the UAE for daring to make peace with Israel, although there are a few other countries who are warming up to the idea and saying, well, if they did it, maybe we will too. And there are people within Israel who are unhappy with making this arrangement with UAE because it might put on the back burners any extension of Israeli sovereignty over any parts of the West Bank. But the leaders of all three countries were able to say, peace now is better than what we might be able to get next week, or next month, or next year. It's not easy. As much as this world is a beautiful place of potential and not just a veil of woe and filled with tears, this world is still really hard to manage. And we need to applaud those who are willing to take a step forward for peace, to begin to move in the direction that will allow Israel to normalize her relations with all of her neighbors, and to establish a better neighborhood for her to live in. Because as our sages taught, Israel cannot have peace by herself. Israel can be as peaceful as she wants within her borders, but if her neighbors are still hostile to her, then she does not have peace. And so Israel will continue to act bravely, not just to defend her borders, but to defend the chances for peace. And Israel will, I believe, continue to extend the hand of peace to any who are willing to sit and negotiate. The negotiations may take months, they may take years, they may take decades. But any time spent talking of peace is better than time fighting a war. And that is the future for Israel that we should pray for. It is the future for the world that we should pray for. And I hope more nations around the world will look at this example and not scoff at the politics and not belittle the UAE leader, who is not exactly a great guy himself, but instead say, look, these people can try to make this better. They are willing to risk something for peace. They are willing to allow peace to actually have a moment where it becomes the headline news. And right now, that is a headline we all need to remember so much. And it is one that should fill us with hope. The days of peace treaties are not done. The days of war are not what must dominate our future. We know from the words of the prophet that eventually we will put down our weapons. We will we will beat our swords into shears, our spears into pruning hooks, and the nation will not learn war anymore. But instead, as the verse before those famous lines tells us, we will recognize that we are all governed by God's beautiful harmony. And we will recognize that there is a way to balance all the peoples in the world and allow all of us to be together. And war will be but a memory, it will be but a piece of history, for we will find a better way to move as one and to move in peace. Shabbat Shalom.